that'll help. And we will obviously be making these all available later, so you'll have access to them. But this is the first time we've gone out into the field with a camera and microphone. And you'll notice, at least on one occasion, specifically when we addressed Nathaniel Green, if you're not aware, Valley Forge National Park, while it is a national park, some days of the week becomes a highway, and lots of traffic cutting through to try and reach 422. As my colleague Arch Hunter will soon attest, and I will turn matters over to him. He has, for a number of years now, conducted all of our traveling workshops related to the American Revolution. He's been a great asset to the foundation, especially since, he's now retired from teaching, and we're pretty much his regular gig. So, welcome, Arch, and I'll turn matters over to you.
Well, Gene, thank you very much. Now that you're in my regular gig, I'm going to take that as a compliment. So Valley Forge, in my opinion, is some of the most hallowed sacred ground in America. And though most people just think of it as a winter encampment, and oftentimes people think that nothing happened there, exactly the opposite is true. When they came out of Valley Forge, General Washington said that the winter encampment was almost a miracle. So there are hundreds and hundreds of stories that had to be told about the winter encampment. And as I say in one of the videos, Joseph Ellis has said that he didn't have very much knowledge of the winter encampment. And when he began to study it, he's going to write a book that's called The Greatest Story Ever Yet Untold. And that is Valley Forge. So we're going to share some clips from Valley Forge with you today. And if we have time, or if we run over, we'll show it again on the other ones on Wednesday. So thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for coming. Jean? Jen? I'm in your hands.
I'm here. I'm going to go ahead and play the first video. If there's any questions throughout any of the videos, please feel free to use the chat feature. And we are going to have you actually send your messages to Jean. It'll be the Freedoms Foundation option for you. And so that's how we are going to move forward. If anybody has any questions, here we go.
Well, we want to welcome all your teachers to our shortened version of Philadelphia campaign, and we are at Valley Forge. At first, I would like to thank Jason and Jean for continuing to try to put this program together this summer. You know, our philosophy at the foundation is to continue to educate students and teachers. So we want to thank them for trying to put this program together. We are at Valley Forge, and we're standing in front of Washington's headquarters. And though it is very small, it's a typical building of that time period. And about 80% of this building is original, not necessarily original from this particular building, but when it was manufactured, it was original from that time period. I believe historically that Valley Forge is very hallowed ground. Many historians debate what's the turning point of the American Revolution. Is it Saratoga? Is it Trenton? Or is it Yorktown? And I believe that it's Saratoga, Princeton, but I also believe Valley Forge is part of the turning point of the American Revolution. Several years ago, Joseph Ellis was writing a book on Washington's slide, and he said when he began to study Valley Forge, he knew very little about what went on here. So he put a title in it from one chapter called The Real Story Yet Untold. And Mitch Ellis is in the process of writing a book about what went on here in the Valley Forge winter encampment. There are a lot of misconceptions about Valley Forge. A lot of myths that have transpired over the years. One of the myths is there was such a long, hard winter with many feet of snow that the men suffered here. Actuality, the third sets up and distributes the net over a 3-mile radius. Then a valley, then an inner line, and another valley. This valley, where it's the back of the public encampment, was the home of Isaac Potts. And this was the forge, an iron forge, and the grist mill. Destroyed forge, and then it became known as Valley. If you look out, you can see you're down in the valley here. And so in September, after Brandywine, Washington has 4,000 barrels of supplies here up in the east on the other side of that tree line up there. You can't see it because of the wind. He has 4,000 barrels of supplies there of flour, horseshoes, digging shovels, and each barrel weighs 196 pounds. Howe sent British soldiers in here to confiscate those supplies. And General Washington sent our friend Alexander Hamilton and likewise Harry Lee to try to get those supplies out of here. Now there's 4,000 barrels. 2 guys and 6 soldiers are not going to get those barrels out of here. They were confiscated. And with all of you that are fans of the musical Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton almost died. As he and writer Harry Lee were escaping to get away from the British, Hamilton jumped on a boat onto Schuylkill, which was stolen because of the rains, and fell out and almost died. So Washington then, in December when he gets here, has no supplies. The Potts family, the Louise family, after the British came through here in September, they vacated. They left because the British destroyed the forge, they destroyed the grist mills, they destroyed many of the surrounding buildings here. So Washington's headquarters was being rented to a woman named Deborah Hughes. And when Washington came here, she rented this home to Washington and fully furnished. So this is what becomes Washington's headquarters. It is very small. There are 15 to 25 different officers that are in this home. The only 2 people that had that little bedroom was General Washington and Martha. And if you can see the bottom, you see the chain. The Valley Creek is behind us, and even though today it's a shallow, not very wide creek, but it is swelling. It can be very dangerous, and many times it goes all the way up to the creek in the bottom of the chain. This is the back of the Winter Canyon, and this is the front center. Everything is laid on. The road that we are currently standing on was the original road that came down Route 23 up over the valley. Came right in front of the headquarters. The kitchen on my right is put on because in the summer you do not want to cook in the heat. So the kitchen goes out over the outside of the home. And Washington staff was fed from this kitchen by Isaac and Hudson. Martha Washington gets here sometime around the 5th or 6th.
Are we still not hearing the audio?
It's going in and out and mostly out.
Yeah, mostly out.
I can't hear anything here at all.
Very choppy, mostly out.
Yeah.
I concur.
I can't hear anything either, and the headphones aren't working any better.
Could he narrate it while it's playing since he's there? And just mute the volume on the video?
famous cake, the one that he liked. And even to this day, every Washington's birthday, the Park Service makes the exact same cake and distributes it from the original recipe that Martha Washington had for the general's birthday. Ironically, General Washington did not like public displays of affection. So when Martha wanted playing song in public, the general asked her, please don't do it because it would embarrass him. So Washington has the song to him in his character. The house itself, with original commercials inside, the railing going upstairs.
The steps going upstairs are all original to the house, and it's been rebuilt during the 1890s and into the turn of the century. The day after Washington's birthday, on February 23rd, coming down this road is another one of the heroes, General Baron von Steuben. Dr. Lohn's going to be talking to you about possibly his name was really Die Steuben, not von Steuben. We call him both, but General von Steuben was a larger than life character. Today he would probably be a professional wrestler. When he comes to America, he shows up with this large entourage of staff of Boston, and he bought them all new uniforms. The problem was the uniforms looked very similar to British uniforms, so when he gets off the ship, all of his men and the Baron is arrested because the Bostonians think he is a British soldier. But when he finally gets here, he comes in here on a huge sleigh, pulled by 24 horses. Every horse had bells on them, and he had this whole entourage with him. So when the Baron shows up, he is larger than life. He's a very large man. They said that the pistols that he personally wore on his uniform were very, very large. They almost look like small shotguns. So the Baron has a whole different personality, but he gets here on February 23rd, and many historians say that he got here on the 23rd because he didn't want the general's birthday to overshadow him the day before. And then even months later, also General Benedict Arnold also comes down this road and meets with the general in these headquarters. So this is the control and command center for the whole winter encampment. Now, what got Washington to Valley Forge? There is high ground, and we'll see that on the outer line. There is a great defensive position because you have the Schuylkill River behind you. This land has been cleared, and there's a lot of trees so the men can build huts. Also, it's very close to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is 18 miles away as the crow flies, and you can get the men here, and you can set up here. And a lot of people say, well, you never want to put your back on a river because you are now boxed in. General Washington had a bridge built across the Schuylkill River up here, which is not very deep and it's not very wide up here. But he had General Sullivan build a bridge across the Schuylkill River over to the Paulings Farm. And that is the only time in American history that an American standing army built a permanent bridge in all of our history. And General Sullivan built that bridge, and unfortunately, when they left the winter encampment, the farmers came back and destroyed the bridge. So this is why Washington's here. He comes in with 11,000 soldiers, and they are scattered all over. He sets up the camp. General Duportail, the engineering general, spreads out the troops. They begin to build the huts. During the winter, because of lack of food, disease, Washington loses about 2,300 men. They die mostly from disease or malnutrition. Only about 30 died here because Washington got them out of the winter encampment out to the local churches that became hospitals. Major generals all are here during the winter encampment. And so this whole winter encampment is a testament to the leadership of Washington, to the stability of Washington, to the consistency of his vision of continuing to fight the revolution. And then during the winter, Washington later writes that this was almost a miracle, because what happened here during the winter encampment, this army is turned around. It becomes a very large army. It becomes a standing, uniformed army, a well-supplied army. And when they come out of here 6 months later, this army now is almost 21,000 men who are fully supplied and fully trained and ready to take on the British. So Washington always said, because he was more in his religious ideas, he said this was almost a miracle here. Years ago, when our sons were in elementary school and we live and grow up in this area, I asked one of their teachers, why don't you go to Valley Forge for a field trip? And the teacher said to me, well, it was a winter encampment and nothing happened there. And most people think that when they come here, nothing happened here. Well, absolutely the opposite. There are thousands of stories, multiple stories here, that when Washington comes out of here in 6 months, this army survived, this army becomes stronger, this army is now stable, and the British really want nothing to do with Washington's army after Monmouth County, because this army does not fight again after Monmouth County Courthouse, which is July of 1778, until Yorktown.
Okay, if there's questions, feel free to send them to me, to the Freedoms Foundation tag, and I'll be happy to field any questions for Arch. We may not really have much at this particular moment, since we had to take a couple minutes to figure out the technology, but we didn't restart just simply because this will all be made available to you after this session. So those first few minutes that you missed, you'll be able to go back to. So I'll wait and see a second if there's any questions. One Arch that, actually a couple of them. How many acres are there at Valley Forge? About how big is the encampment?
Well, the federal park, Gene, now is 3,400 acres, which is approximately half the size of Gettysburg. During the winter encampment, the encampment stretched all the way out up to the Freedoms Foundation, and to the west or to the east, all the way out towards Chesterbrook, which is now.
Arch, I'm sorry, you may want to restart because your video cut out, or your audio cut out for a second.
Okay. Now,
sorry.
The park is approximately 3,400 acres today, which is a little under half of the size of the Valley Forge National Battlefield Park. During the winter encampment, it was much larger. It went all the way out past, all the way out to the Freedoms Foundation property, and then farther out to the east. So 3,400 acres today is part of the park.
There was one other question. Someone had read that apparently no one froze to death at Valley Forge. Is that?
We have no real reading that anyone froze at Valley Forge because of, as Nancy said earlier, it was a very mild winter, and the average temperature was 32, almost 33 degrees. So again, that myth that was a very harsh winter and there was a tremendous amount of snow is one of those mythologies probably that comes from Mr. Weems, because it was such a mild winter. But we don't have any indication that anyone froze to death at Valley Forge.
Right. And then someone asked, how many soldiers did the average hut house?
Well, each hut, according to Washington's dictate, was 14 by 16. Each hut housed, had 12 bunks in it. 6 men were always on duty. The other 6 were off duty for 12 hours at a time. But if everyone was sleeping at the same time, an enlisted hut would have 12 bunks. No one had their own bed. You simply grabbed some straw or some long grass, you brought it in, you laid it out, you put your blanket on top of it, and you grabbed whatever space was available. But 12 were mandated for each cabin.
That's pretty unfathomable, which I'm sure folks will see when they go through the park. That's pretty amazing. All right. I'm sorry, there's one more question. Are there any burial sites or burial markers in the park for soldiers that were buried there?
There are actually 3 that we know of all the years of the Army Corps of Engineers coming in. There's actually what we believe to be 3 people buried. 2 are over by the General Anthony Wayne statue in what we call Wayne's Woods, which is the right flank of the winter encampment. And there are 2 unmarked graves down in the woods. The 3rd grave is over by Washington's Chapel, right at the bottom of the really tall obelisk that was put there in 1920 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And that gentleman is from Rhode Island. And he is the only named soldier of the 3 that we know that are buried at Valley Forge.
And then one other one. I don't know if you know the answer to this. How many huts were there in total? Do we know?
Well, there was 900 huts, Gene, out on the Muhlenberg line, and I sent everyone the teachers the maps if they want to look at their maps. So there was 900 huts on the Muhlenberg line. By February, there was 1,200 huts, and very likely by March or April, there was close to 2,000 huts in the winter encampment.
Okay, thank you. Jen, if you want to roll the next one, please.
Now we are looking behind me at the DeWeese house, William DeWeese house, which is behind us right on Route 23. DeWeese owned the Iron Forge here. Isaac Potts and William DeWeese were brother-in-laws, and they were in business together. Isaac Potts owned the grist mill and the saw mill across the street along the Valley Creek. DeWeese was a Quaker, but he was a colonel in the Pennsylvania 4th Militia. So he was running the militia, but also being a Quaker, he was very hesitant about supporting the revolution because of his religious background. And so Washington and the higher command thought it would be very appropriate to hide the 4,000 barrels of supplies in the DeWeese house. So if you read anything about the DeWeese house, it's oftentimes called the Bake House because of all the flour that was there, and they were able to use the kitchens and the supplies in there. The house, again, as we said, was taken over by the British. It was pretty much destroyed. The 4,000 barrels were taken. So months later, when Washington gets here, there are no supplies. There is nothing for him when he gets here. This is the carriage barn to my right. So when the general or an officer wanted to go somewhere, the outer barns, their horses or carriage would be brought here. The horses would be saddled or put together, and then they would wait until the general or the officers came out of the house or their cabins, or some of them were still in tents, to go out and go through the camp. So this is a holding stable, and then the white building behind us was a larger stable where the horses were kept. And remember, with 11,000 men here, you have the necessity, your animals are very important. Today, it would be the equivalent of your tanks and your armored vehicles. Not only did the men need to be fed here and housed here, but all the 5,000 animals and horses and oxen that needed to be fed. A horse eats 50 to 60 pounds of hay a day. So now Washington also has major problems with getting not only the men supplied and fed, but also the horses and the other cattle, particularly oxen and cows, to be fed. So this is the area, and it's a very important area, the staging area and the barn, the DeWeese house. And William DeWeese doesn't come back here until after the revolution is over. So this is very important to understand this. Again, the Valley Creek, it's right on the section here. The Valley Creek today, if you look at it, is very shallow and it's not very wide. When there was forges here, the Valley Creek powered the mills. So it was dammed up about a half a mile down, and they used the paddle wheels on the forges. People lived here their whole lives. This was the far, far, far remote area of Philadelphia. There were schools here for the employees' children. There was stores here. And so this was almost like a company town that we see in the 1870s and 1880s. So it was very self-contained. So when the British come through here and destroys the forge and destroys these buildings, we also have many lives being destroyed and incomes being destroyed, which now causes even more trauma for Washington in this area. Washington was not supplied here by the locals. Contrary to what we often see on a professional sporting event, on a national event, when it's from Philadelphia, and they show us the Liberty Bell, and they say Philadelphia is the cradle of liberty. This was a very loyalist area. It's full of Quakers. I believe, and I'm a Philadelphian, that Boston is the cradle of liberty, because this area full of Quakers would not sell or supply Washington's troops. They were selling their goods to the British because they could get metal money for it. So Washington has major problems here because there is a tremendous amount of loyalists in the Philadelphia area, and religiously the Quakers, that also cause tremendous problems for Washington's troops here that he must overcome through the winter, which he does with a new Quartermaster General, Nathaniel Greene, General Anthony Wayne, and Baron von Steuben.
This is a very famous.
Okay, Arch, while we're actually waiting to see if there's questions from teachers, I'm going to actually reinforce your assertion, because I don't know if you've ever heard of the scholar, it's a great name, E. Digby Baltzell. He taught down at University of Pennsylvania, and he sort of reaffirms Arch's point, but from a later period in history. Baltzell was a professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and is famous for coining the term WASP. But one of the books he writes in his career is called Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia.
Huh.
And he compares the two cities and makes an argument that those religious traditions directly affect how both Bostonians and Philadelphians present themselves, not just only from the period of American Revolution, but well up into the 20th century. He wrote the book in the 1970s, I believe it was, but there's still certain things that hold true. But with that, there's a question in from a teacher. Were the private homes donated to the Army, or were they taken by eminent domain?
Yeah, the first part of the first video is when the British came through, when General Howe sent Cornwallis in to take those supplies from the Dewees house. They destroyed a lot of the buildings. And so the Potts family left and the Dewees family left. And then what we know is Washington's headquarters was rented to a woman. And when Washington came in, Washington then rented the home from her fully furnished. So some of the buildings and some of the homes were destroyed, but Washington's headquarters was not. And he was able to rent that from the woman, and he virtually paid for it himself, and it was fully furnished. So Washington was very concerned, particularly in the Philadelphia area, not to destroy the private homes of any civilians because of what it would do to cause great negativism towards the Continental Army. So that home his headquarters, he rented for the 6 months that he was here.
All right, and then just a clarification question. Dewees Mill was mostly served as a grist mill?
Isaac Potts owned the grist mill.
Mm-hmm.
Dewees owned the iron forge. And so there was a grist mill back up on the Valley Creek. There was a grist mill, which was owned by Potts. Dewees owned the iron forge, and they were brother-in-laws. Mm-hmm. So they really worked together on that.
Okay, they're the only questions I see that came in.
Right.
Jen, if you would kindly go to the next video.
May I make a comment before we go to the next video, Gene? My family came over from England in 1703 and settled in the Philadelphia area, and they were Quakers. And I still have a tremendous amount of family members that are today present-day Quakers. So Philadelphia was a very Quaker area and a very loyalist area. So there's 2/3 of the people approximately that really don't support the revolution in the Philadelphia area. And sometimes, Gene, people accuse me of being anti-Quaker because I make that statement, and I am not, because it's in my family blood. The reality is that the Quakers would sell their goods and their food to the British because the British had metal money and it was valued. The continental money was paper, which was virtually worthless. So Washington had to hire a quartermaster general, which was Nathaniel Greene, and then actually he sent out Anthony Wayne to New Jersey. Daniel Morgan went out to the Lancaster area and pretty much convinced farmers to give their supplies and their food and their clothing and blankets to the Continental Army for IOUs.
Thank you. Jen, if you want to do the next one, please.
This is a very famous statue of General Washington. There are 6 different aspects of his life in this statue. He posed for it for about 2 months sporadically, and they got tired of posing for it. So this was done by the sculptor Houdin, and there are 7 of these. This is one of the replications of the original. The original is in the State House in Richmond. This was up in the Visitor Center for many, many years, and it is exactly the life size of George Washington. He was 6'2½". At the beginning of the Revolution, he was 175 pounds. By his death, he was 205 pounds, and most people think that he was very, very chubby. He was not. He was a very big man for the time period. Today, he would probably be the equivalent of an NFL linebacker. in his physique. He was a phenomenal horseman. Phenomenal horseman. Several times his soldiers during battles thought he was going to fall off his horse, and they watched him maneuver the horse so they never fell off. So this represents the different aspects of Washington's life as a diplomat, as a general, as a soldier, as president. And there are 7 of these, and in the 1840s and 50s, Great Britain asked the United States if they could have one of these to memorialize General Washington. Washington was well known in Europe even before the Revolution, and he was well respected, not necessarily as a general, but as a gentleman. So the British asked if they could have one of these statues to put in London. The problem was, Washington said at the end of the Revolution, he would never step on British soil for the rest of his life. So now we have a quandary. And they went back and forth, and Congress went back and forth, and finally someone came up with the compromise. They went to Mount Vernon, they dug up 2 55-gallon barrels of dirt from Mount Vernon, they put it on a ship with one of these statues, they sent it over to London, the British dug a hole, put all the Mount Vernon soil in it, and then put the statue on top of the soil. So Washington technically is still not ever standing on British soil. But this, if you come and you stand next to the statue, you can see the largeness of Washington, the leadership of Washington, and the strength of Washington in this statue. And it's just a phenomenal thing to see. And you can sit here and study this statue with all the different aspects of the general's life. We all know that Washington is the father of our country. The revolution could not have been won without George Washington's leadership. Our presidency still is the way it is today because of the stability and the leadership of Washington. Remember, when the revolution was over, Washington voluntarily resigned his commission, stepped down, and went home. When King George read that Washington resigned voluntarily from this point of power, he actually fell back into his throne chair and said, "My God, this has got to be the greatest man that's ever lived. How can any person ever give up that power?" That is Washington. At the last day of his presidency, he stood outside the State House in Philadelphia, waiting for now President-elect Adams to walk in and Vice President-elect Jefferson to walk in. Washington stood outside, and he said, his last public statement was, "I stand here, your president. I will leave this building as a common citizen of America." That is why we fought the revolution. And that is the heart and character of this man. In my opinion, the greatest American who's ever lived.
Okay. If someone has questions, please feel free. I don't see any at the moment, but I'll wait a second before we go to the next one. Unless you have any comments you want to make, Arch, while we're waiting.
Gene, in his largeness as a human being, Washington was a phenomenal equestrian also, and many of the soldiers said, oftentimes complimented him and wrote how well he did being able to keep on his horse and stay on his horse and keep his horse up during a battle or when the horse would seem to be falling. So Washington was a phenomenal equestrian, even with his largeness. Something that's usually overlooked in Washington's life, Gene, is that he was also a tremendous businessman.
Mm-hmm.
Washington created Mount Vernon to be much, about 100 times larger than it was when he first took it over. And Gene, Washington is our only Southern founding father who did not die in debt because of his skills as a business person. He left an estate of approximately $200,000, which today is equivalent to a little over $300 million. So Washington's part of his life at Mount Vernon was just this great businessman that he was to years before leave mercantilism, grow new crops, do the crop rotation, come up with all sorts of different types of fertilization for the ground, and became very, very prosperous as a businessman, as a general, as president, as equestrian. So there are so many aspects to his life that oftentimes we overlook because of his generalship and then of his presidency.
That's true. One question did come in. Did Washington have a specific horse that was his, or did he use a specific breed? Or
he had two Arabians, and oftentimes we say they were white. Technically, it's not a white horse; it's a gray horse that gives the it looks like it's white, but it's actually gray. And one was Nelson, and the other one was Blueskin. And he liked Nelson a little more because Nelson was a little bit more gentle, but Nelson was very skitterish in battle. So oftentimes during a battle, when Washington was looking at the parade or looking over on the field, Blueskin is the one that he would be out there riding, because Blueskin was a little bit more steady with all of the loud silence going on all throughout the battle. So Blueskin and Nelson.
Gotcha. And then one other question someone asked, and kind of an interesting question I hadn't thought of. Did Washington correspond with Jefferson at all about farming?
Yes, he did. Actually, Jefferson took several of Washington's ideas, particularly with the fertilization and the crop rotation, over the years that Jefferson was overseeing Monticello.
Okay, thank you. And Jen, if you would like to start the next one, please.
We are now overlooking the Grand Parade, and it's about 1.5 miles long, and it's almost 3/4 of a mile wide. This is where Baron von Steuben, or Die Steuben, brought the army to be trained. The Baron gets here, he becomes the Inspector General for General Washington to train the troops. Washington's private guard was sent out here, which was about 100 men, and the Baron trained them out on this field to be a standing army, how to march, how to volley, how to do a joie de foi, how to hinge, how to come on and off the field and have troop movement systematically. After about 2 weeks of the Baron training Washington's guard, Baron brought the General Washington out here and put his private guard through their drills. Washington was so impressed that he had the Baron and his 100 guards turn around and train the rest of the army. So Washington now is going to have a standardized army that's going to be trained by Baron von Steuben. He comes from Europe. He comes from the German Prussia area. He does not have a job because there's no war going on. He's looking for a job. He goes to Paris to visit Benjamin Franklin. He tells Benjamin Franklin that he was an inspector general in the King of Prussia's army. Franklin says, Continental Army could need you. Franklin writes him a letter of recommendation, tells him to come to the United States, go to the Continental Congress, and see if he can get a job. So when the Baron gets here, he's in Boston, he goes down to Carolinas, he finally meets with our Continental Congress, which is now out in York because they have vacated Philadelphia. They read the letter, they sent him out here to Washington, and that was the story of coming in with that massive flag. I believe that the American Revolution was won out on this field. because the American army under Washington was trained here by Baron von Steuben how to be a standing army. So when the French come and sign the Treaty of Alliance in May, they are all up on that hill, which was behind that tree line, and they're looking down onto the Grand Parade. The Baron von Steuben brings the troops out here, which are now almost 21,000, and puts them through their drills. And it was extremely impressive standard procedures that he was putting them through. And he had them do a joie de foi, which you fire down one line, you fire up the next line, and you continue that process for about 15 or 20 minutes. And the French are so captivated that Washington now has this large army that was trained out here by Baron von Steuben. He not only trained the troops out here, but he brought in hygiene. And so sickness really went down a tremendous amount, because von Steuben now puts in hygienic rules that the vaults or the potties or the bathrooms or the outhouses now have to be a quarter of a mile behind all the huts. They have to be redug every 3 days, and no man out in this field is any longer allowed to relieve themselves wherever they want to. So von Steuben brings in order. He brings in standardization. He brings in discipline here, and these men are trained out here in this grand parade. And when the Washington's army leaves here, they leave here a standing army that's well trained, and it's well supplied, and it's well taken care of. And now this army that the British thought was going to die out here during the winter of 77 and 78 now is the opposite. It's a large supplied, standardized mechanism that begins to become the first modern army in the United States. Von Steuben was not an inspector general in the Prussian army. He was a lower ranking officer. Now, I know that most Americans are very unfamiliar with padding a resume. No American does that. Well, von Steuben did that. He doesn't speak English. He only speaks German. Ironically, the only English words he knows are curse words. So he's screaming out orders in German, has to have them translated from German to English by another one of Washington's orders for men to be put through their drills. So it's like he's like a first-year teacher. You're writing your lesson plan for the next day the night before. He's writing all the drills the night before for doing them the next day. And ironically, or interestingly, some of von Steuben's blue book, that he called it, we are now still using in the American modern army. Standardization, being able to have everybody do everything the same, discipline, the hygiene, that's all because of Baron von Steuben coming here and training the men out on the field. And now the French know that Washington has a standing army that can fight the British toe-to-toe.
Thank you, Arch. And if you notice, as I mentioned earlier, Valley Forge National Park gets quite a lot of traffic, and there's a lot of construction going on. They're building a new visitor center and some other stuff, and hence all the beeping, in the proximity to Arch for that that one piece there, just so everybody understands what the background noise is. So, well, one question I have here from a teacher is, for von Steuben, is his position a new position for the Army, or had someone else actually tried training on a large scale?
There was actually 2 inspector generals before von Steuben, and even one was General Mifflin. And actually, Mifflin was a quartermaster. He quit. Then he comes back for a small period of time at the beginning of Valley Forge as the inspector general. But Gene, none of American generals has any idea how to train troops. Mm-hmm. That's the important thing. So, von Steuben, because of the training that he received in the Prussian army, he knew what it was to have standardization and being able to train troops as standardization. The American generals most of them had very little to no military background at all. And most of them were very familiar with how small militias would fight, but not on that large scale. So the American Army had no standardization in it until Baron von Steuben, or D. Steuben, as Nancy will tell us, gets there to do this training. So now, if you're from Virginia or Rhode Island or Pennsylvania, you're now all fighting together as one standardized army, and your officers are not your local militia officers. They could be officers from any part of any of your colonies. So these men are now all going to fight the same style, which was very important because they're now going to fight the British in the European style of military fighting.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. So Jen, if you could start the next video. Oh, hold on a second.
This is a very famous statue of.
There was one other question just popped in. And Arch, I think you answered part of this, but you might be able to fill in more color. What was von Steuben's background before coming to America? I mean, I know you mentioned he was an officer, an unemployed officer.
He was a low-ranking officer, and in Europe, you only got paid when your army was fighting. So that's why oftentimes while the British hired, the 30,000 Hessians, that was pretty much standard that one king or queen or ruler, they would rent their army to another country so they could get paid. Von Steuben didn't have a job because the army wasn't fighting. So he was a low-ranking officer in the Prussian army. And also, Gene, we now know that he was not really a baron. He claimed to be a baron, taking some obscure title because of a relative. And so he takes on the title of being a baron. But we know it was probably much more hype than it was in actuality. But again, no one's going to question that in that time period.
Thank you. And sorry, Jen, if you can start that now, please.
Of Baron von Steuben overlooking the Grand Parade. Jason pointed out a few minutes ago, if you look at that statue, you can see the enormity of that statue and how large Baron was. One of the reasons is that the statue is so large, if you can see at the bottom, that it was erected by the National German-American Alliance in 1915. So because the Baron is German and it's 1915, obviously they're going to put a very large statue of Baron von Steuben here. Much larger than what we saw with the Houdon statue of Washington down at Washington's headquarters. But the Baron is looking out on the Grand Parade, and he's looking and watching all the troops being put through their drills, and he's screaming and he's yelling out orders and he's sweating profusely. And he was like one of those professors that we all had in college that was very animated and walked all over the place and sweated and jumped up and down and was constantly in motion, the Baron von Steuben. He then becomes a general, and he stays here for the rest of his life. He lives up in New York. New York was so grateful for what the Baron did, they gave him 10,000 acres to live on up in New York. And also, he claimed to be a baron. He was not a baron. But who is going to check that? No one's going to check that. He claimed that he had some right to be a baron because of some obscure person in Germany that he inherited that title from, but that's never been substantiated. But no one is going to question that. No one's going to question that because what he did to help the Continental Army and help Washington win the American Revolution. He makes a very interesting statement about Americans, which is very true. He said, you know, in Europe, when people are given a command, they obey. Here in America, when men are given a command, they ask why, and then they obey, which is very typical, particularly for any of us that have children. How many times did our kids always ask us why when we asked them and told them to do something? So that was very characteristic of what von Steuben saw with the Americans. He loved the Americans. He loved the spirit. He loved the attitude of what they were trying to do here. And again, he is part of what Washington labeled later on almost a miracle, when he comes here and he brings in the hygiene and he brings in the structure and he brings the standardization here, that wherever you are from, you are now going to all be trained the same. Behind us is the fields that General Varnum used to train African Americans who came to the Army. This Army was an integrated army. There was Oneida Indians here. There was African Americans here. General Varner took command of training African Americans because most of them came from New England, Rhode Island, where he was from. And once they were trained, they were all put into the line. It's not, so we don't have an integrated army again until the Korean conflict. This was an integrated army that all the men were trained the same and they were put into the lines. And now we have commanding officers who are going to give the same commands and no longer just simply militias doing whatever they want. Because of the Baron, because of General Varner, and because of the leadership of Washington, this army leaves here a standardized, powerful, well-trained, and well-supplied army.
Thank you, Arch. A good question. In fact, something you and I were talking about the other day when you were in the office. Was there any pushback during World War I and World War II about von Steuben's role in the revolution due to anti-German feelings?
Not particularly that we know of the General von Steuben, but because of World War I and the German influence, there was a great deal of animosity towards Germans and even a lot of German Americans. And that's why one of the reasons that that statue was put there by the German American Federation to help us all realize that von Steuben, being a German, helped us with the American Revolution. But again, because at that point, you know, we're so far past the revolution, most people in World War I, and again, even in the 30s and in the 40s, we don't think of, most of us don't think of Baron de Steuben as German. We think of him as an American. So it's all according to, you know, what our mindset is through that time period and who was able to help us with our revolution.
And just a quick aside too, because we now stumble into part of my academic specialty. If you really are interested in that response to Germans in World War I, at least, Russell Kazel, K-A-Z-A-L, Becoming Old Stock, The Paradox of German-American Identity, and he specifically focuses on Germans in the Philadelphia area, which, if you're not aware, when I was younger, there were about 12 different distinct German clubs that were regionally based, even a Tyrolean club, German-speaking Italians, which most of that has kind of died away. But anyhow.
And Jason, or excuse me, Gene, one comment about when Baron de Steuben gets to Valley Forge, he spends a week every day for about 7 or 8 hours just going around to all the different aspects of the winter encampment. And he's not saying anything. He's just taking notes. And after a week, and then he finally comes back to General Washington and gives him his report and what he believes needs to be done there. And Washington, fortunately, listens to what de Steuben says and then implements so much of what de Steuben wanted to do. And the men would constantly say when Baron de Steuben would show up, his physical presence alone would cause them to behave. It's like, I remember as a little kid, when the principal came into your room, how scared to death we were of the physical presence of the principal. That's what a lot of the men felt when De Steuben would come around and inspect their part of the camp, and particularly the vaults, you know, because he was also very, very big on the hygiene that was going on at the camp.
Okay, thank you. Jen, if you could start the next one, please.
We are now overlooking the Grand Parade, and it's about 1.5 miles long, and it's almost 3/4 of a mile wide. This is where Baron von Steuben, or De Steuben, brought the army to be trained. The Baron gets here, he becomes the Inspector General for General Washington to train the troops. Washington's private guard was sent out here, which was about 100 men, and the Baron trained them out on this field to be a standing army, how to march, how to volley, how to do a joie de foi, how to hinge, how to come on and off the field and have troop movement systematically. After about 2 weeks of the Baron training Washington's guard, Baron brought the General Washington out here and put his private guard through their drills. Washington was so impressed that he had the Baron and his 100 guards turn around and train the rest of the army. So Washington now is going to have a standardized army that's going to be trained by Baron von Steuben. He comes from Europe. He comes from the German Prussia area. He does not have a job because there's no war going on. He's looking for... This is a very famous statue of... We are now standing at the General Nathaniel Greene statue that he's also looking out over onto the Grand Parade. If you come to Valley Forge, this statue is on the property of Washington's Chapel that was created and built in 1903. It's an ongoing existing Episcopal church. So this statue is a little obscure. People can drive right by it. It's on the property of Washington's Chapel. General Greene is also a phenomenal story. If you don't know much about Nathaniel Greene, please read about this man. He is a Quaker by birth. He is raised in the Quaker faith. He is from Rhode Island. He was always very interested in military, which was anti-Quaker. He goes into Boston as a young man to go into a bookstore to look for books on military strategy to read. He happens to meet the bookstore owner. They get into a long conversation with each other. They talk about military strategy. They become friends, and they become lifelong friends. And ironically, it's Henry Knox. So when Knox becomes an officer, he says to General Washington, well, I know somebody that might be interested in becoming an officer because he's a friend of mine and he's read a lot of military history, which is Nathaniel Greene. Greene becomes a very interesting character. He actually gets ostracized from his family because he joins the American Army, the Continental Army, which he is now ostracized for the rest of his life. He becomes a staff member and then ultimately lifted to become a general under George Washington. And it's Anthony Wayne who literally saved Washington's life after the battles of Long Island when Washington was escaping down into New Jersey. It's Nathaniel Greene who is the rear guard so that Washington is able to get out of there and then get down through New Jersey and back into Pennsylvania. Greene is a phenomenal military general. When Washington is here, he has lost his quartermaster general, Thomas Mifflin, a couple of months before because Mifflin quit. He did not did not like Washington. He thought he was incompetent. So Mifflin quit and went to the Continental Congress to try to get Washington removed. Washington needs a quartermaster general. He says to Nathaniel Greene, would you become the quartermaster general? Nathaniel Greene says, General, no one writes in history about quartermasters. They write about combat generals. But because of my love and respect for you, I will become the quartermaster. And General Washington said, well, you will have a dual command. You will be quartermaster and you will also be a line commander. And this is Nathaniel Greene. He begins to get the men supplied here. He sends men and troops out into Lancaster to get supplies. He sends Anthony Wayne into New Jersey to get supplies. And they begin to bring in food and clothing and blankets to get the men supplied here at the end of January, beginning of February. Greene has a staff of 40 men and officers in the quartermaster department. When the Army leaves here, June 19th of 1778, and begin to march across Pennsylvania into New Jersey to catch the British, Nathaniel Greene takes his men, and every day they're out about 10 or 15 miles ahead of Washington's army, setting up the camps, setting up the tents, setting up the campfires, and having the food ready. So when Washington's army gets there that night, all the men have to do is eat, rest, and sleep to get prepared to move the next day. This is the systematic situation that Greene caused and he developed to become the quartermaster general. Later on, when the war moved south, Congress asked General Washington, who do you want to be the commander down there? Washington said Nathaniel Greene. They sent Benjamin Franklin, who lost his army. Congress then asked General Washington, who do you want to command the South? Washington, I said Greene. They sent Horatio Gates. And he vacates his army at Camden. Finally, Congress acquiesced to Washington. Nathaniel Greene is sent into the South. He works with the militias in the South. He works with Anthony Wayne. He works with the Marquis de Lafayette. And ultimately, Cornwallis is chasing Nathaniel Greene all over the South. Finally, Greene quarters him at Yorktown. And Nathaniel Greene is the one who really wins the revolution in the South because of his ability to work with the militias, to work with the small army that he has, to work with Daniel Morgan, and he corners Cornwallis at Yorktown, so Washington is able to get this army down to Yorktown with the small French army under General Rochambeau and have Cornwallis surrender at Yorktown. Then for the last 2 years, General Greene and Anthony Wayne are going all over the South to clean up the small bands of British soldiers and loyalist militias to secure the South, so the British finally signed the peace in December of 1783. Georgia loved Nathaniel Greene. They gave him a plantation. And he lived there for the last few years of his life with his wife and his children, Caddy Greene. And he was out one day looking at his fields and he got a sunstroke. He came home, collapsed on his bed, and that night he passed away. He's only 44 years old when he passes away. And Georgia loved Nathaniel Greene because of what he did. This is, again, one of those unsung heroes, these miraculous stories of how a Quaker with no military background becomes a phenomenal general, takes on the superpower of the day, and helps defeat the British Army for us to secure our independence.
Thank you, Arch. There's one quick question here of were there anti-German feelings towards the Pennsylvania Dutch as well as the Germans?
In what time period?
That doesn't specify. I would assume, later on.
Well, first of all, I misspoke. You know, it's hard enough to listen to something, Gene, when you hear the traffic noise.
Yeah.
It's even as difficult to try to concentrate on what you're saying when seeing these cars go whizzing by. But that's not an excuse. I've said Benjamin Franklin. I misspoke. It's Benjamin Lincoln, who was the second commander in the South. The Pennsylvania Dutch, if anybody knows those, you know, when Washington takes Trenton, he gets 900 Hessians as prisoners of war, and many of them he sent out to the Lancaster area for the rest of the war, and they become the Pennsylvania Dutch. So by World War I and then 1930 and the 40s, most people, particularly Pennsylvanians, they know those former Germans to be Pennsylvania Dutch, and they really don't correlate them to Germany of World War I or World War II. So that feeling is not meant towards them at all during World War I and World War II.
Well, and you figure too, Pennsylvania Dutch are largely pacifists, so.
Yeah, the Pennsylvania Dutch are largely pacifists, and for anyone who has visited Lancaster County, Gene, you and I know that we really can't be upset with the Pennsylvania Dutch because of the phenomenal restaurants and smorgasbords that they have for us to partake in out there.
Pies, lots of pies.
Yes.
But that's the only question I see here. Jen, if you could kindly run the next one. And actually, as Jen's doing that, well, go ahead. One quick thing, just so you're aware, I mean, part of the reason we're doing this is since you can't be out in the field, we sent Arch out to try and bring the field to you. And when he mentions that cars are going by in that previous video, where that statue is, for those of us who know where it is, when the cars go past Arch, they're probably missing them by about a foot. So, just so you know, I mean, if there was a way to clear that stuff out of the audio, we would. But as someone who's you know helped make documentaries and stuff, it's a nightmare place to film. So it turns out probably about as best as we could possibly make it. But again, with that, thank you. And Jen, if you could do the next one.
We are now up on what we call the Muhlenberg line. So this is the left flank of the outer line of Washington's defenses during the winter of 1777 and 1778. So they start here with his first cabin under General Muhlenberg, who was a general from Virginia. His father was a minister in our local area, up in Collegeville area, in a little place called Trapp, Pennsylvania, which is about 3 miles from here. So this is the left flank, and this is what the huts were supposed to look like. Washington sent out direct orders on December 20th that the men were to build the huts 14 by 16. They were to have 12 sleeping per hut, a fireplace in the back, a door in the front for the draft. The enlisted men were to have their huts in front, systematically in order. The officers were to be sporadically behind the enlisted men's huts, and they were to look out towards Philadelphia. If we look out here, this is Philadelphia is this way, and so the huts were supposed to be here. The men were to dig a trench across the road here, which did not exist at the time, and keep their eye out on Philadelphia in case the British came out of Philadelphia. Again, this is what the huts were supposed to look like. No hut looked like this. The men are simply building a hut any way they want. They are not systematically lined up. They are not aligned. Washington sends the orders out. No one is really paying attention to General Washington as having an authority because he's really not the commanding officer of the Army yet. He is a name, but Congress hasn't given that authority yet. So the men are only listening to their militia officers and not really paying attention to the severity of Washington's orders. It's the equivalent when we're teachers to having a substitute teacher come in the classroom. So the men are getting in, trying to build as quickly as possible. Some of the men dug down. Some of the men only made huts about 5 or 6 feet high. They certainly were not packed. And this is a red clay area. You can pack these huts with red clay. It becomes very, very hard. But this is 20th century, 21st century models of what the huts were supposed to look like. And if you looked up this line during the winter, the huts are scattered all over the place and nothing is systematic. And no hut looks the same. So these huts are drafty. These huts are small and large, and it looked like Kansas after the tornado, because no one is really paying attention and taking Washington's orders seriously as the commander-in-chief. When this is in about 6 weeks' time, there are 900 huts beginning here on the left, all the way up past the arch, all the way up to the General Wayne Monument, which is the Pennsylvania line. So they cut straight across, and there's a little over 900 huts here. So within a few weeks, there are no trees up here. All the trees are cut down. There are no fence rails up here. They're all using them to begin to build their huts. If they had built these huts properly, several years ago during the winter, a few of the rangers came up here in February, which is the coldest part of our Northeast winters. They opened up one of these huts, they started a fire, and when the hut warmed up, it got to be 70 degrees and stayed that way. So when Washington gave these orders for what these huts were supposed to look like, these men would not have suffered in the cold if they had obeyed the orders, but they did not at first. So you're 12 men to a hut, no one has their own bunk. You go to sleep, you simply go into your hut, you grab some straw, you lay it on one of the flat boards in there, and you put your blanket down and you go to sleep. 6 men were on duty for 12 hours. 6 men were off duty and they could sleep for 12 hours, and they would disperse it back and forth. And again, they're looking out towards Philadelphia. There's a trench across here, and a long trench from this line all the way up to the Wayne line, which is over a mile, and they're simply watching to see if the British come out of Philadelphia. General Howe, during the winter, never came out of Philadelphia. In April of 1778, General Howe had enough of the revolution. He asked to resign his commission and go back to Great Britain. He was allowed to go back, and immediately he is court-martialed. In this time period, folks, court-martial was very common because they want to find out really what happened. There is no 24-hour-a-day news. There is no video camera. So Howe was court-martialed, and during his proceedings, he was asked, why didn't you defeat the Americans? Howe said, I took their capital, I defeated Washington's army. But this revolution is not a physical geographical location, nor is it a city. This revolution is in the hearts and the minds of the colonists, and no one will ever be able to defeat that. And Howe was absolutely right. The other reason Howe said he didn't come out here, because Washington has the high ground. This is high ground, and even though Washington's army is weakened, if you look behind me, you can see that the British Army coming up this hill, marching up this hill, would be an absolute slaughter for the British Army. And if you remember, Howe led the attack on Breed's Hill, on militia that had built a redoubt overnight. And it was a major disaster for the British Army at Breed's Hill, and Howe always remembered that. Howe lost 40% of his men on Breed's Hill with a redoubt that was built overnight. And he was never going to do that again. So Washington picks the high ground. He is on the high ground, and even in a weakened state, General Howe is not coming out here to ever take on Washington's army in the midst of a winter.
Okay, Arch, question for you. And actually, maybe you can use it to talk a little bit about the huts in general and the process the park has for them, because teacher asked, are there any true archaeological hut remains at Valley Forge that have been explored?
Gene, I'm snickering at that because down from those huts that they just saw, back in the 1920s, they unearthed 2 foundations and several layers of 2 huts. And they had them on display for many, many years. And so we could show the students exactly how helter-skelter these huts were and how open they were in between the logs. And unfortunately, probably 5 or 6 years ago, that the Park Service decided it was a lot easier to mow the grass straight across rather than to mow it around those huts. So they took them out. And they disassembled them and they took them away, and those parts are in their storage areas somewhere in all their archives. So there's no remains left there at all, unfortunately, of any of the huts. And remember, because people ask this question a lot, when Washington's army leaves, the farmers come back, and they need to they need to plant crops. And this land was so devastated. As Nancy said this morning, Washington got the army out of there in April and early May because the land was so devastated. The farmers really could not farm any of this land for 2 years. So when the farmers come back, they disassemble all the huts, they rebuild their fences, and no one thinks that this is ever going to be a national park. So they take all the buildings down and all the huts down and reuse it for their farmland.
Good. And then the Park Service, the huts that are there, they leave them what, for about 3 years, and then they build new ones because they get buggy, if I remember right?
They did originally back in, because a lot of these huts were built during the 1930s with FDR's New Deal with the CCC. And the more modern huts, they're able to withstand the weather a lot more because of the tarring of the logs and what they're doing to those to maintain them. So the older huts probably last about 5 years, but the more modern ones, the one that they built the last few years, will last, I believe, 20 to 30 years because of the treatment of the wood.
And then did the men cook in the huts?
They cooked outside. There was no cooking that went on inside the huts. They were purely for men to sleep and to get warm. All the cooking was outside. It's not long, Gene, that a German baker from Philadelphia, he invents a portable oven. And Washington has about 50 of those portable ovens come out there, and they're all put together with hooks and loops. So they could set those ovens up and begin to bake a lot of the bread and what needed to be done to feed the men out there. So the hut, there's no cooking in the huts. It's all outside of the huts, around the campfires, or from these local bakers that eventually get to Valley Forge.
Okay, if there's no other questions, let's start the next one, please.
We are now looking out on the other side of the cabins, looking out onto the high ground, and behind me is a cannon which was a 3-pounder. If you notice that where the cannon's pointed, it's actually pointed in the wrong direction. When Valley Forge was a state park and it became a national park in 1976, in 1976 for the bicentennial, this great state of Pennsylvania gave the park to the National Park Service as a gift. The National Park Service came in here right before the bicentennial, and the historians immediately said all the cannons in this park are faced the wrong way. They were all facing Reading. They should be facing Philadelphia. So they had to come in, turn all the cannons around, and back in that time period, there was cannonballs welded to the bottom of each cannon. When it became a federal park and more people started coming in here, the Park Service began to see that these cannonballs started to disappear because Americans love to steal things from national parks, so they took all the cannonballs out. So this is a 3-pounder. Washington also had 8-pounders, 12-pounders, some 16, and some 24. And it's just the size of the cannonball. Soldiers marched shoulder to shoulder because the muskets were very inaccurate. When you had an army marching at you, you faced your cannons down into the ground, so the cannonball would go out and skip along the ground like you're skipping a rock, and it would take out the men. It's almost like human bowling. And so when there was a hole in the line, they would simply close up the line and continue to march forward. And all the men were always told, if you see a cannonball coming at you, don't try to stop it. It's going to take your arm or your leg off, which several times we see that happening. So the 3-pounders were lined up to fire out on an angle that they would hit and then skip along the ground and take men out. If the army got within 100 yards or so, they would put grape shot in the 3-pounders or the 8-pounders, and it's a bag full of steel balls about the size of a golf ball. And it was a really thin-skinned bag that they would tie rope thread all around the balls, and it looked like giant grape shot. They would fire that out, and those balls would go out, disperse all over the place, and they would go right through you. If you were within 50 to 30 yards away, they would put canisters in these cannons, about the size of a coffee can, with 700 ball bearings, about the size of a BB, and they would fire that out, and it would literally, within 20 yards, it would probably take out somewhere between 35 and 45 men. It would just chew them up. And then if you got past the cannons, the grape shot, the canister, the cannonballs, they would charge at you with the bayonets. And the bayonet was the weapon of mass destruction of the day. It's 18 inches long. It's a blunt point. It goes back to about 1.5 inches. It's triangular. So if someone is stuck with a bayonet, it's going to hurt. And when you go to pull it out of a body, you actually have to wiggle it because the body closes in on it. So they have to jiggle it to pull it out. You're going to get bayoneted 2 or 3 times. The reason it was triangular, because the human body will close on 2 sides alone. It can't close on 3 sides. You feared the bayonet. That was such a fearsome weapon. It was actually outlawed by World War I. Unfortunately, folks, human beings do something really well, creating weapons to kill each other. And the cannons and the bayonets and everything else they were using were tremendously devastating these armies. And even in the next war, the Civil War, they're still using the same military strategy, but now the weapons have become so much more accurate. So this is the cannons. We're facing Philadelphia, and then we can't see it because of the growth. You put redoubts, which it's a French word for forts, on either side of your lines, so you cannot get flanked. So we start here on the left with the Muhlenberg line. We go up all the way a mile to the Pennsylvania line, where General Wayne had the Pennsylvania troops, and this is the outer line, and this is where the majority of men were for the winter of 77 and 78.
Okay, we will pick up with the remainder of this on Wednesday, since we are now out of time. So when we talk about the Battle of Paoli at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, we can start actually here and pick up from here and go forward. If anybody has any questions, remaining questions for Arch, please go ahead, send them to me. But while we still have a few minutes, just a reminder, tomorrow, 11 o'clock, we'll hear from Mike Harris regarding Brandywine. And he is in many ways the guy on that battle. He has a book out about it. And then later in the week, when you hear for him about Germantown, he has a new book coming out about Germantown. But we'll hear from Mike in the morning. And then in the afternoon at 1 o'clock, as if you've been with us before to any of our on-campus programs, you know that one of the things we try to do to help teachers is we bring in some other folks to do some pedagogical work. So in the afternoon, 1 o'clock, you'll have a man with probably the most interesting name yet so far in a Freedoms Foundation program, Lightning J from the University of Pennsylvania. And he did, and I believe Jen did already make them available, or they should be available. There are some worksheets and stuff that you will probably want to print off beforehand just to kind of have them, and you'll be breaking out into rooms and all that sort of stuff. So unless there are any questions, we will bid you a good afternoon. If anybody's having technical problems, hang on till after everybody's gone and Jen can help you out. Okay? Thank you. And thank you, Arch. As always, good stuff.
We'll see everybody tomorrow. Great.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.